The history of the native entanglements with the imperial protagonists in the Revolutionary War is a story unto itself. I will not dwell much on it, but the posting of the Atlantic colonies, once complete, only intensified grievances and liberated the settlers' appetite for more land westward. The frontier areas were a virtually ungoverned shooting ground. The excesses of frontier justice had no equal except for the Western justice that was to follow. The Indians, who generally had no inkling of what it meant to own land, it was God's country, trekked ahead of the onslaught of foreigners or attempted to assimilate in place. In July 1778, Tories, commanded by Major John Butler, and loyal Iroquois, Senecas specifically, attacked in concert the Wyoming Valley frontier of eastern Pennsylvania. But by October, the Continental Army recovered the wasted territory. Indians and Tories then moved on the Cherry Valley in New York and later the Schoharie Valley and western settlements in Pennsylvania land all the way to Pittsburgh. George Washington was directed by Congress to eliminate the Iroquois by all means necessary. He gave the job to Major General John Sullivan with instructions to pursue the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many persons of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. Sullivan's campaign, starting from about east in Pennsylvania, ranged up the Susquehanna Valley, the Chemung Branch, into the Finger Lakes region of New York to modern Elmira. His 5,000-man army burned about 18 Indian villages to the ground, according to the record. The white woman, Mary Jemison, captive and adopted child of the Seneca, remarked,
"They left nothing but our bare soil and timber. There was not a mouthful of any kind of sustenance left, not even enough to keep a child one day from perishing with hunger."
These kinds of maneuvers and clashes of the Continental Army with the British Indian allies of Joseph Brant sowed confusion and hastened the eventual disintegration of the Iroquois Confederacy. Civil war between the Church of England Mohawks and Puritan Oneida fighters also broke out. The Onondaga, according to Barnes, were devastated by plague before the war was over. On March 8, 1782, near Gnadenhutten, Ohio, militiamen from Pennsylvania murdered 96 unarmed Christian Native Americans associated with a Moravian mission, quote, while they prayed, unquote. By all accounts, the dead were 39 children, 29 women, and 28 men. 2 boys escaped, although one had been scalped. The approximately 150 militiamen, led by Lieutenant Colonel David Williamson, later claimed the massacre was a retribution for raids by Indians on settlers, though these Lenape were pacifists and apparently not part of the attacks. The militia decided their guilt anyway and informed the group they were to be executed. I quote,
The Indian villagers requested time to pray and prepare for their deaths, which the militiamen obliged. Before they restrained the villagers, bludgeoned them with mallets to stun them, then fatally scalped each. Afterwards, their bodies were piled in mission buildings, and the village burned to the ground.
Crawford's Dance of Death. One colonial outcome of this unspeakable act in Ohio was the death of a friend of George Washington and participant in the Fort Duquesne battle many years before, Colonel William Crawford. In June, near the Sandusky River, Illinois country, New France, now Wyandotte County in Ohio, Colonel Crawford was brutally tortured and executed by Delaware Indians, purportedly in retaliation for the so-called Moravian massacre described above. In passive attendance at the execution was Simon Girty, an Irish-born colonel born near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who was abducted as a child by the Seneca people and assimilated into their culture. Girty was known to Crawford because he often had acted as a liaison between the Indians and the Europeans. Girty was also known across the frontier as an unscrupulous turncoat, rascal, and killer, even depraved. The details of Crawford's death, reported by an eyewitness, Dr. John Knight, are hardly bearable to read, so be forewarned. The following is a quote from Knight.
When we went to the fire, the colonel was stripped naked, ordered to sit down by the fire, and then they beat him with sticks and their fists. Presently after, I was treated in the same manner. They then tied a rope to the foot of a post about 15 feet high, bound the colonel's hands behind his back, and fastened the rope to the ligature between his wrists. The rope was long enough for him to sit down or walk round the post once or twice, and return the same way. The colonel then called to Girty and asked if they were going to burn him. Girty answered, yes. The colonel said he would take it patiently. The Indian men then took up their guns and shot powder into the colonel's body, from his feet as far up as his neck. I think not less than 70 loads were discharged upon his naked body. They then crowded about him and, to the best of my observation, cut off his ears. When the throng had dispersed a little, I saw the blood running from both sides of his head in consequence thereof. The fire was about 6 or 7 yards from the post to which the colonel was tied. It was made of small hickory poles, burnt quite through in the middle, each end of the poles remaining about 6 feet in length. 3 or 4 Indians, by turns, would take up, individually, one of these burning pieces of wood and apply it to his naked body, already burnt black with the powder. Some of the squaws took broad boards upon which they would carry a quantity of burning coals and hot embers and throw on him, so that in short time he had nothing but coals of fire and hot ashes to walk upon. In the midst of these extreme tortures, he called to Simon Girty and begged of him to shoot him. But Girty, making no answer, he called to him again. Girty then, by way of derision, told the colonel he had no gun, and at the same time, turning about to an Indian who was behind him, laughed heartily, and by all his gestures seemed delighted at the horrid scene. Colonel Crawford, at this period of his sufferings, besought the Almighty to have mercy on his soul, spoke very low, and bore his torments with the most manly fortitude. He continued in all the extremities of pain for an hour and 3/4 or 2 hours longer, as near as I can judge, when at last, being almost exhausted, he lay down on his belly. They then scalped him, and repeatedly threw the scalp in my face, telling me, "That was my great captain." An old squaw, whose appearance every way answered the ideas people entertain of the devil, got aboard, took a parcel of coals and ashes and laid them on his back and head after he had been scalped. He then raised himself upon his feet and began to walk round the post. They next put a burning stick to him as usual, but he seemed more insensible to pain than before.
The doctor at this point was led away and did not witness the final death of Crawford and his ashes. The doctor himself, facing the same fate of similar horror, eventually escaped and survived, walking more than 300 miles to safety.